On your exam review outline, it says trust monies. Well, so tell me, what are trust monies? Give me an example of trust monies. Earnest money is an example. What else? Security deposit. What else? What? Due diligence fee is not. Good job. How about rent? Rent is trust monies, everybody. So in other words, if you're managing property for somebody else and the renter sends a check to your company, it needs to go into the trust account of that property manager's. And the trust account, everybody, is an account that has checks you can write, because the money has to get out sometime, doesn't it? And so the property manager collects the rent. They wait until the check clears before they start writing. He'll write a check to his company for management fee. He'll write a check to the owner with the proceeds of the rent after any kind of repairs and management fee. So earnest money deposit, security deposit, and rent. Let's talk about when those have to be deposited. Earnest money deposit and security deposits must be deposited no later than 3 banking days from
before the deal's closed.
contract date. When you get a contract. So when do we get a contract? When the offer is accepted and communicated. Okay, let's review this, everybody. Earnest money and security deposit checks must be deposited no later than 3 banking days from contract date. Contract date on an offer to purchase is when the offer comes in and it's presented, the seller accepted it with no change, and it was communicated back to the buyer or the buyer's agent. Everybody good? Security deposit, same thing. A lease is a contract. So the lease is drawn up when both parties have signed it and both parties know that it's a contract, then the 3 banking days would begin. Everybody good on that?
So, I know that you said that like the contract isn't like binding until the other party hears about it and whatnot. So all of these people are just submitting their earnest money and hoping that the seller accepts their offer? Oh, and they just get their money back?
But Saturday doesn't count as a banking day?
No, Saturday doesn't count as a banking day. Justin has asked a pretty good question, or a point. Justin says, so when buyers make offers, they write earnest money deposit checks, maybe. Some do, some don't. But didn't we say it's important to have earnest money from a seller point of view anyway? If they write that earnest money deposit, it stays with the offer until there's a contract. So in theory, as a visual, if the offer comes in with an earnest money deposit check, you would go to the seller and present and show them the check and say, here's the earnest money deposit check, here's their offer. If you decide that you accept all terms and sign it, and we notify them, this check will go into our company's trust account. Okay? Oftentimes, though, remember your sales contract says that the offeror, who would be the buyer, the offeror can say, I'll bring my earnest money 5 days after contract. Didn't the sales contract say that? Because maybe some buyers say, I don't want to just give a check right now. I'll wait until I know it actually is a contract, and then I'll give you my earnest money deposit. So if you get it later like that, the 3 days will start ticking when you get it. Didn't we have that discussion? Let me remind you where it is. Jose said no, we didn't.
I don't remember.
You don't remember? Well, at least you're honest. Everybody's honest.
I'm
Yeah.
thinking I don't know.
At least you're honest. Hold your place and go to 274. Well, now, maybe, was I here teaching it?
See, they don't remember.
If I was here teaching it, you heard it before. You might not have gotten it. All right, page 274, 1D dog. And D, the purchase price, see the initial earnest money? If it comes with the offer, it says you can have a check, personal check, bank check, or if it comes within 5 days of the effective day of the contract. Effective date means when it did ripen into a contract. So if the earnest money check comes within 5 days, well then you couldn't have deposited on that first 3-day rule. You'll have 3 banking days after you get it. Does that remind y'all some things? We talked about that. Alrighty. If you are a property manager and you receive rent, rent always has to be deposited immediately, no later than 3 banking days from receipt. So if you get a test question, they say, when does rent get deposited? 3 banking days from receipt. When does if you see the word monies, 3 banking days from receipt. Okay? The trust account, I heard Ian say this. Go with me, everybody. The trust account section is on page 634 and 635. We've got some information there. How about even on page 633? Let's go there. The trust account is also called an escrow account. Escrow, trust, demand account, an impound account, but it's an account that is labeled trust account or escrow account because that signifies that this account is not that company's money, it's monies of others. And so what that means is, should the real estate company go bankrupt, that money won't be frozen. It's an account that has monies of others. So it's protected from that. The trust account would have to be in an insured bank or savings and loan, FDIC insured. So credit unions are not FDIC insured. I know they have insurance that's equivalent, but it's not FDIC. So let me say that one more time about the bank. The trust account needs to be an insured bank or savings and loan in North Carolina or another state that does business in North Carolina who would be willing to make their records available should the Real Estate Commission need to do an audit. So it has to be designated. What does demand account mean? Why would it be called a demand account? You can demand it right then, right? In other words, a demand account versus a CD, a certificate of deposit. If you put money in your savings account in a CD, you can't just go in there and demand it out. It has to mature or you're going to pay penalties. There'll be something like that. So that would be what we mean by a demand account. Go to page 634, please. In your left column, they're asking about how many trust accounts would you need. The answer is you only need one, you meaning the real estate firm, if they hold trust monies. So if your broker company holds trust monies, they only need one account. And all of the people's monies would go into that one account. There would be ledger sheets, there would be, what are those cards called? What are those ledgers and I can't think of the right word. It's an accounting, you know, each property would be notated on the deposit, on the ledger. I mean, it's a real accounting job. So you can have multiple, and think about these large real estate companies that have lots of agents, lots of listings and sales, then that one account would be sufficient. If you are in property management, you can have one trust account also. What if your company does brokerage and trust account and property management? Technically, they could have one account. Probably, I would think they would have it separated, but it could be all in one account if it's one firm that's doing it. Where more than one trust account is necessary would be if you have a company that manages homeowners associations. So there is that business of managing homeowners associations, and if you had that business, you would have to have a trust account for each association that you're managing. And that makes sense, doesn't it? All right. Bottom left of 634, they're bringing up commingling. You know, commingling is mixing up your monies with others, so let's talk about that a moment. I said to you that earnest money deposit, if your company has a trust account, would be deposited immediately no later than 3 banking days from contract. Justin asked about, so people are making those earnest money deposit checks and they're not being deposited? Probably not until there's a contract, but it could be. The rule is immediately no later than 3 banking days from contract. I don't imagine that big companies will deposit earnest money deposit checks when you're just in the offering stage, because in the offering stage, it may or may not turn into a contract. And then you've got bookkeeping issues to deal with then, right? And you couldn't get the buyer the money right away back. You'd have to wait until the check cleared before you did it. So commingling is mixing up the company's monies with monies of others. Cannot do except when a company opens up an account with the bank may charge service fees for that. If the bank is charging service fees for that account, the rule of thumb is the company can have up to around $100 of the company money in that account for the maintenance of the account. And so you don't want to just put a whole lot of your own money in there. That would be called commingling. But you can have in there what is needed to manage the account so that when they draft out the service charges, they're not, that account's not going in the hole, because it needs to be, or they're not using any monies of others. The broker in charge is responsible for that, and the account can be interest-bearing as long as the parties to whichever contract that you're working with, as long as they agree where the interest will go. We talked about disputed earnest money before, didn't we? That was in our sales contract. Hey, did I tell you I think you ought to go back and read that sales contract? There's a whole lot in there that will help you. If the earnest money deposit is disputed in regard to whom it goes to, so for example, buyer and seller enter into a sales contract. Earnest money deposit was deposited. Buyer does not terminate the contract during the due diligence period, but they get the appraisal a week later and it was low, and they say, I'm not buying. So we know that it's breach of contract if it's after due diligence, don't we? And so they've breached, they say, I'm not buying, but then they say, but I want my earnest money back anyway. The sales contract says, no, that's what the seller gets if you breach. Well, the buyer says, but I want it, so I'm going to dispute that. Well, then the firm cannot release any of that earnest money, can they? Unless the two parties have an agreement. What would be the other alternative?
Give it to an attorney.
What court? Clerk of court.
Clerk of who?
Clerk of court.
Clerk of court.
Well, maybe if you look on page 435, clerk of court. I'm trying to be serious and teach you something. And, the clerk of courts, yeah. It sounds funny now that he's saying it. The clerk of courts in the county where the property is located. So if there's disputed funds, the escrow company, the real estate firm, if it's a firm, will hold it until the two parties agree. Or that firm can say, we're going to send a note, a 90-day notice to these two people that we want them to have it settled in 90 days. If it's not settled, we're going to release it to the clerk of courts in the county where the property is located, and they will keep it for 1 year. So the disputing parties can go try to navigate through that and get it settled that way. But if it's not settled in 1 year, it will escheat to North Carolina Treasury.
Nice.
Escheat.
It's cheap.
Remember that? All righty. So on 635, we've talked about that. We talked about handling the money. And on 635, right-hand column, option fees and due diligence fees. A due diligence fee is sort of like an option fee, isn't it? Is it? A due diligence fee is sort of like an option fee, yes or no?
Yes.
Why is it sort of like an option fee? What makes it similar to an option fee?
You have the option to buy the property if you want it.
An option fee is you have an option to opt in, and a due diligence fee is
Money for the seller.
you have a right to walk away. So in other words, what I'm trying to say, and I'm not saying it very well, is both cases you're buying time to decide about the contract. The due diligence fee, you're in the contract and you're deciding if you're going to terminate. That fee pays the seller for that, right? The option fee, you're not really in the contract, all the terms were negotiated up front, but you're saying, I'll let you know if I opt in. And you gave an option fee for them to hold it until you decide if you want to opt in. So due diligence, you decide to terminate, opt out. Option, you're deciding whether you're going to opt in. So they're similar in that regard, and they would be given to the seller immediately, no later than 3 banking days from the contract date. Immediately would be best. All righty. Broker in charge duties. Name something. You guys know this already. Tell me what a broker in charge, some of the responsibilities of a broker in charge. Oversees the PBs. What does that mean, oversees the PBs?
Make sure they're not messing up.
Their contract,
Make sure they're not messing up.
they probably have to review their contract when they write one up, I assume.
Well, they supervise the PBs, and however they do that, I don't know how a broker in charge figures out how they're going to do that, but they're responsible for the PB, supervising them. So yes, Andrea, I think that would be training more, even though we learn here the contract, learning it from this angle. We're learning some things that you're going to use in your real estate career, but you'll need more training on it. Because after all, we are learning, your goal is to pass a test.
Right.
Hopefully you'll retain enough that will give you some understanding when you do go to work, but your BIC will train you. Make sure you get some training. What else are they responsible for? Management of the entire office, what does that mean?
Just kind of giving guidance, overseeing issues, probably handling concerns.
So the entire office would include who
Of all the brokers and
and who?
administrators.
It's the entire office, it's employees and everybody. The BIC is responsible for that office, that branch office or the main office. Technically, they don't supervise brokers though. They have a responsibility for the entire office, so I would think they would want to make sure the broker has their license active, that they took their CE and they took all their post and all of that, but technically they don't supervise brokers. So let me give you an example, because on that take-home test you're going to have some questions a little bit like this. If a PB works under a BIC and the provisional broker misrepresents a material fact, the complaint will go to the PB and the BIC. The BIC will get the complaint too, because the BIC is responsible for the PB. Once you reach your non-provisional broker status, the complaint would come just to you. That make sense? So, all righty. On page 630, requirements to have a broker in charge. All offices, all brokerage offices, real estate offices must have a broker in charge at, let's say, on site. In other words, a lot of these companies, real estate companies, have branch offices. Each branch office has a broker in charge. So you have to have a broker in charge. And they need to be available, everybody. You know, I was talking to my son last night, and I see a BIC as being on call 24/7, really. You know, you're there for when your PBs need you, and they need you all different times, don't they? So the broker in charge is more than likely, well, let's say in larger companies, there'll be an employee of the firm too. In smaller companies, there may not be the revenue available to pay a salary for that BIC in order for them to give up their brokerage job. In other words, some small companies, the broker in charge might be out there listing and selling still because the firm can't afford to pay them to quit that job. But the larger firms, your BIC will be just the BIC, and they're responsible. It reminds me, not the same, but it reminds me a little bit of being a sales manager at a company. You know, just overseeing and making sure they're over the trust account, whether they actually do that bookkeeping or not. They're responsible for that trust account to be reconciled every month and to be correct. And so if an employee embezzles or does something wrong with the trust account, the BIC will be responsible for it. Let's talk about how the person gets to be a BIC. In order to become a broker in charge, you would have to be non-provisional, which means you're not PB anymore, right? You're non-provisional, you've taken all 3 of your post-licensing courses. You would also have to have at least 2 years full-time brokerage experience within the previous 5 years, or 4 years part-time brokerage equivalent within the last 5 years. Any questions on that? I've had my license since 1977, so I've had my license over 40 years.
How many questions were then?
Huh?
Do you remember how many questions you had in the test?
I remember the test was hard back then. We had to do a closing statement back then, you know, fill in all the closing statement. But that wasn't my point. Now I forgot my point.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Broker in charge. Thank you, Ian. I would not qualify to be a broker in charge if I wanted to open my own company because I don't have brokerage experience within the last 5 years. I haven't been selling real estate. So I don't believe I would be qualified to be a broker in charge because I mean, yes, I teach this all the time, but I don't know that they would look at that as brokerage experience. So I don't have brokerage experience. So you would have to, in order to become a broker in charge. So the way that process works is they would send in a form online, everything's online now, the commission, to designate themselves BIC of a certain company. Once they declare or designate themselves BIC of a company, there is a course that a broker in charge has to take, and this is test question areas here. They have to take a 12-hour broker in charge course within 120 days from the designation of becoming a BIC. Now that should be in all this section here on 630 and 631.
You see, within 90 days?
What now?
Would the firm hire them? In other words, you can't just designate yourself as a BIC, can you?
Well, you would have to,
Or you apply for the job after you become a BIC?
no. You would, your firm would be looking, the firm would come to you probably and say, the broker in charge we have now is leaving, we would like you to be the BIC. And so before you can be the BIC, you would have to be declared BIC. And yes, you do it for yourself, but you can't just say I'm a BIC and not be a BIC. I mean,
Right.
so yes, there's the chicken or the egg, yeah,
Or if you wanted your own business, I guess you would have to do that.
yes. Well, good point Andrea's asking. If you wanted to open up your own business, sole proprietor, just in your own name, you would have to declare yourself the BIC of yourself. So all firms have to have a broker in charge, even if it's a single entity corporation or a sole proprietor or whatever, there would have to be a broker in charge. And so if it's just you, you could be the broker in charge of yourself. And on page 630, in the left-hand column, they do bring up, and they don't give you much information about it, but they do bring up this term called qualifying broker. And so if you're a sole proprietor, you would have to be the BIC and the qualifying broker of your company. The qualifying broker is someone who probably has a financial interest in that company. So at a large company, it would be a president or a vice president of that real estate company, somebody, CEO, somebody that's got a financial interest in that company. They would declare themselves the qualifying broker, which really means they're over the BIC. And which means if that BIC were to leave, the qualifying broker has to immediately check to make sure the trust account is up to date, if the company has a trust account. And then they would make sure there's another BIC stepping in immediately. All right. You good on those things? All righty. Agency contracts. Guys, go back in your Appendix A. Your agency contracts would begin, let's find it, page 624. Now, this is your Unit 7 and 8, your Unit 7 and 8 in your textbook, but this is a nice section to read here. So let's review a little bit about agency contracts. We know that any agency agreement with the owner of the property, so that would be seller or landlord, right? Any agency agreement with the owner of the property would have to be in writing at the beginning of the relationship. Is everybody good on that? So if you want to put a house on the market, list a house for sale, it would have to be in writing before the sign goes up. You would have to have the listing, the permission in writing from the owner of the property to list their home. If you're managing property for someone else, the property management agreement would have to be in writing before you begin that job. The only verbal agency that we're aware of is the buyer agreement, right? Tell me what you remember about oral buyer agency.
Until an offer is made.
Buyer agency can be created verbally and must be put in writing, Kim's saying, before the offer is written. Now, in your reading, it might say before the offer is presented, but really and truly, it's expected to be in writing before you write that offer. Because when you're writing the offer, are you going to advise them or not? And if you have a verbal agency agreement, well, you are their advocate, but getting it, if you're asking them to put it in writing and they say no, well, then you're not their advocate anymore. And so you cannot advise them about the terms of the offer. So agency agreements for the buyer need to be in writing before the writing of the offer. Everybody good? If it's verbal, tell me what you know about verbal buyer agency other than that point.
Nothing's enforceable, they can work with whoever they want, buy whatever they want, and you're just. Yeah.
S-O-L. S-O-L. I have to tell you, I know what those initials mean, but the other night in class, one of my students came out with an expletive, and I was thinking, I'm glad we're not on tape. And I went, ooh. I say words like that too sometimes. Try not to in class. But yes, it's not binding is what she's saying. It's non-binding, it's non-exclusive. So that means what Kim says is real life. They're not bound to you. They can go work with anybody else they want to. And if they find a house through somebody else, you were a volunteer, the commission says, if you didn't have your agency in writing. I don't know why that's an issue, to be honest with you. I do think an awful lot of agents don't put the buyer agency in writing until the writing of the offer. I don't understand that really. I would like to have it in writing early on because you're going to be spending a lot of time trying to help that client, and it seems to me you would want them bound, but no later than the writing of the first offer. All right, so what about the dual agency? What about dual designated if your company offers that? Can that be verbal?
As long as it wasn't in writing.
Wait. No. Well, you just told me buyer agency can be verbal. So are you telling me that you gotta ask them to put dual in writing?
Both customers have to be, clients have to be in agreement for you to be showing anything.
Okay, let me go back to my question. Can dual agency be verbal? Yes. Yes, it can be. Until the writing of the offer or until the presentation of the offer. Let me give you one quick example. Hey, Barry. There might be some real editing going on that today. I've forgotten to turn it off. It's just been a day. Jose's been keeping me distracted. If you meet with a buyer and you want to create agency because first substantial contact happened, you're going to explain agency, you're going to use the brochure and explain agency, and ask the buyer, would you like for my company to represent you? And if they say yes, and then you say, well, let me get some of the paperwork and let's go ahead and get that out of the way, and they go, oh, I don't want to sign anything. Well, then you can create buyer agency verbally, can't you? For temporary is the idea. But when you're talking about that buyer agency agreement, everybody, you got to talk about dual agency. Isn't that on the buyer agency agreement? So you have to have that discussion. And if they can give you the permission verbally, but we know it must be in writing, all of that before the writing of the first offer. What we're talking about is, what if Kim went to get a listing from the seller, and Kim really explained dual agency really well, but the seller says, no way, Jose, I do not want dual agency, and you can talk all day, but I don't want it. And so Kim does not have dual agency permission from the seller, but she's got the listing. So the listing will go through MLS because the seller says, I'm perfectly fine with you co-brokering. I just don't want somebody at your company representing a buyer and showing my house. Well, that could present a problem, seller. We have over 100 agents and they get lots of buyers and they want to be clients too. So are you telling me you don't want us to show it? That's what I think. That's what I want. Anyway, so they said no. So you don't have dual agency. Jose calls Kim up and says, Kim, Jose and Kim were in the same company. Jose says, Kim, I see your listing at such and such address, and I think that my buyer client would really want to see that. But I noticed that we can't show it because it says no dual agency available. And Kim's going to say, because she's on the ball, she's going to say, Jose, let me call the seller and see if I can get this one-time permission because it's in their best interest, isn't it? Before she does, she's going to say, Jose, is your buyer agency verbal or in writing? Because that tells her what kind of permission to get from the seller. Are you with me on that statement? He says it's verbal. So when Kim calls the seller and explains and asks the seller's permission for dual agency, it can be verbal before, on this end, the writing of the offer, on this end, before you actually present the offer. Rewind it. If Kim asks Jose, is your buyer agency verbal or in writing, and he says it's in writing, that tells her she's got to get the seller's permission for dual in writing before they even show it. Does that make sense? All righty. So agency agreements, they're employment contracts. Your Unit 8 gives you a lot of information, of course, because that was what it was about, but I want to remind you of something about what the Commission says agency agreements must address, and I'll just read it to you real quickly. Commission Rule 104, in writing, signed by all parties. All parties means spouses, doesn't it? Guys, doesn't it mean a spouse? If you go out to list a property and only one person owns that property, and they're married though, it takes two to sell, doesn't it? And then it says license number needs to be on that agency. It must have a definite ending date. You all know that, don't you? It must terminate. And then it has to have that non-discrimination language. We know we also put our commission rate or how we're going to earn our fee on that agency agreement. We talked about agency agreement. Agency would have to be disclosed, of course, before the agreement happens. And you all told me about first substantial contact. There is another contact that I want to mention to you, and seems like I did one day on page 626. Did I mention to you about the initial contact? Seems like I did when I was telling you about my investor buying that condo, and the agent told me everything before I even had a chance to say, oops, I'm a buyer's agent. Didn't we talk about that? You call to make an appointment, and you're supposed to, on initial contact, say, I am a buyer's agent. Initial contact means to the other firm. So everybody, I would say, first substantial is broker to consumer. Initial contact is broker to broker. Does that make sense? So if I call ABC Realty to want to make an appointment to show their property today, I'm going to say, hello, this is Jan Secor. I'm a buyer's agent. I would like to show your house at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Everybody good? All righty. The firm is the agent. Remind yourself that. And so all of the agents underneath that umbrella of the firm are sub-agents to whom? Not the firm. Clients. Let me re-say that, because I know this is confusing. I'm not trying to trick you. I know it's confusing. The firm is the agent to the client. So in other words, when we sign a listing agreement, the first part of the agreement says this is between the firm and the seller. This is between the firm and the buyer, right? The firm is the agent. You work for your firm, and because you do, it makes you a subcontractor to all of the clients that hired the firm. So I'm saying subcontractor because that term makes sense, doesn't it? The real estate term is sub-agent. You are an agent to your company, though. So you're an agent to an agent, making you a sub to the client. So you're a sub to all of them, all of the clients. Now, if your company practices dual agency, then all of us would be dual, wouldn't we? The firm would be technically the dual agent, and you don't see it written this way. You're kind of a dual sub-agent to both clients, aren't you, at the same time? That's why you're neutral. If we go into designated dual agency, who's the dual agent? No.
The firm.
The firm. Guys, listen to that for a moment. If your firm practices dual designated, what does designate even mean? What's the purpose of designated agency?
Appointed by the.
Appointed by the big for what reason?
Because you're not too, one of them was too much about the.
No. Let's don't think about the appointment part. Why do we have designated?
Maybe so that one broker represents one side of it specifically and only that side of it.
Ian said because one broker is going to represent only the buyer, one broker is going to represent only the seller, so they are exclusively on those sides. So that means they're not dual anymore, those two brokers. The firm, however, is still the dual agent.
So those two brokers can advise anything to their client?
They can.
Okay.
So Jose says, so those two designated agents can advise anything to their client. Yes, sir. So what that even means is if you're the designated agent for the buyer and you find out after you've become designated that the seller is really in some dire straits, you better tell your buyer because you're an exclusive buyer agent now. Everybody with me on that? Once you've gotten out of the middle. Now you said if you knew something confidential right here, before you got out of the middle, you wouldn't be able to be designated if you knew something confidential about the other client.
Then how is that, would that still be listed as a dual agent that needs to be in writing to the client?
Yes, ma'am. Everything is still dual agency.
Yeah.
Dual designated is an alternative to dual. So you can't have designated without dual. So in your listing agreement, there's a little checkbox. Do you want dual? Yes or no? And if we offer designated, yes or no? So it's just a subset alternative, if you will.
So even if there's designated, it's still, you're in dual.
You're still in dual. But what I literally said was the real estate agents are not.
Right.
The firm is. Everybody good on that? All righty. Let me talk about a couple of more things real quick, and then we'll carry on with our review tomorrow. Top of page 628, left, about advertising. You've got a question about advertising and a blind ad. 628. A blind ad is an ad without the company name in the ad. So in other words, if you want to advertise and you work for Company X, Company X's name needs to be in the ad, even if you are advertising your own listing. Tell me if you're good on that. Guys, when you're going to be self-employed when you go to work into the real estate business, right? So if you want to advertise in different venues like that little real estate magazine, you're going to pay for that yourself because you're self-employed if you want to do that. But you have to advertise under the permission of the BIC. They have to see what you're advertising, and the company's name has to be in the ad. If you don't have the company name in the ad, it would be called a blind ad, and it would be reason to get disciplined. And so someone said, well, do you have to have the company phone number? That's not a rule, but it's silly not to have a phone number, but that's not a rule. It's the firm name that must be in the ad. So you can't advertise in your own name, and you can't advertise in your client's name either. And then we talked about the broker in charge. Now, guys, here's what I want to do tomorrow. I really want us to have a controlled review. It'll be in your best interest. So what we'll do tomorrow, I gave you the answers to that test that you all are told me that you didn't take yet. And so we'll go over some of that first thing. There's a lot of license law questions in there. In fact, it's the bulk of the test that I think will help you. And then we'll take this review and just kind of go through our outline and go through everything that we can and answer any questions. But now your questions need to be spot on. We can't go off on tangents tomorrow because everybody's getting tense about it. And y'all seem real laid back for some reason, but I'm pretending like you're tense. And so we need to stay on target tomorrow. And I'll hang around a little bit if you have any questions now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. See ya.